In the dazzling banquet hall of an upscale restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina, golden lights shimmered against champagne glasses, the clinking of silverware blending with bursts of laughter. Tonight was special. Everyone had gathered to celebrate Sophia, my daughter who had just graduated college with honors. At the center of the long table, Edward, my husband of 28 years, rose to his feet, raising his glass high. All eyes turned to him, waiting for the heartfelt toast to his daughter. I, Victoria, sat beside Sophia, my hand resting gently on hers, a proud smile on my face. But instead of praise, Edward's voice rang out, cold and sharp as a blade. I've decided to start a new life. Without her, the crowded room fell silent. Silverware stilled midair, half-finished sentences froze. Over 50 pairs of eyes swung toward me. A few phones were raised discreetly, capturing the cruelty of the moment. At the far end of the table, Rachel, the woman who once called me sister, smirked ever so slightly, her eyes flashing with triumph. Beside me, Sophia went pale, her face drained of color. Everyone expected me to collapse, to scream, to storm out in humiliation. But instead, I smiled, a calm, unsettling smile that sent ripples through the stunned crowd. I reached into my purse and pulled out a sealed, cream-colored envelope, placing it neatly beside Edward's glass. "This is a gift for you," I said softly, my voice steady, as though everything was already decided. Edward's smug expression flickered. I leaned over, kissed Sophia on the cheek, and whispered, "No matter what happens, today is still your day." Then I rose, smoothed my dress, and swept my gaze across the room full of gaping faces. "Please, everyone, enjoy your meal. I wish you all a lovely afternoon." In the heavy silence, I strode toward the exit, head held high. And just as the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, Edward's panicked scream erupted from inside. "Victoria!" "What the hell is this? What have you done?" A cold smile tugged at my lips, because inside that envelope was not just divorce papers, but the beginning of a revenge I had been planning for months. As the heavy restaurant doors closed behind me, the sound of restless whispers still echoed inside. Some guests murmured in pity, others shook their heads, and a few lifted their phones higher, eager to capture a clip that would spread online. To them, I had just lost everything. What they didn't know was that the show had only just begun. My name is Victoria. I am 54 years old. For nearly 3 decades, I have played the role of the devoted wife and the sacrificing mother. When Edward failed, again and again, in his reckless business ventures, it was me who kept our family from collapsing. I worked overtime, put my dream of opening a financial consultancy on hold, and patched the holes he left behind. Edward had tried opening a cafe, then a woodworking shop, then investing in a friend's company. Each lasted barely 6 months. And each time, I quietly covered the losses, using savings and financial expertise to keep us afloat. Sophia, my daughter, was my only anchor. I had saved every dollar to secure her education, determined to give her a brighter future than her father could. Today should have been her proudest moment, but Edward twisted it into a stage for betrayal. And then there was Rachel. Nearly 20 years younger than me, she once laughed in my living room and called me sister. She had sat at our Christmas dinners, even phoned me for career advice. All the while she was seeing my husband behind my back. When Edward made his announcement, I caught the flicker in Rachel's eyes from across the room. Triumph. She believed the victory was hers. And my friends? They had known. They'd whispered, maybe even laughed, but no one warned me. Their silence cut as deep as Edward's betrayal. But here's what none of them knew. I had discovered the truth long ago. I had been watching, gathering evidence, preparing each move. That envelope I placed beside Edward's glass was the spark meant to rip away his carefully crafted mask. As I walked out of that restaurant, I was not the loser. It was Edward who had just triggered the very revenge I had been planning for months. 3 months before the graduation dinner, I began noticing cracks in the picture-perfect facade of our family. Unfamiliar withdrawals appeared in our joint account. At first, just a few $100s, then thousands. I had managed our family finances for 20 years. No number escaped my eye. My instincts screamed something was wrong. One evening, Edward left his phone on the kitchen counter while stepping outside for a call. The screen lit up with a message. "I saw the beachfront condo. Perfect for us. You just need to make the final move. Signed, Rachel." I froze. Not out of shock, but because pain had hardened into something colder. I didn't scream or cry. I calmly took a screenshot, saved the evidence. From that moment, I knew. This wouldn't just be the end of a marriage. This would be a calculated revenge, carried out with law and precision. I met with Martin, a long-trusted attorney. In his small office, he pushed his glasses up his nose, reading aloud from the prenuptial agreement Edward and I had signed nearly 3 decades ago. "There's a fidelity clause here, Victoria. If we can prove the affair, he'll lose nearly everything." I nodded, a strange calm rising within me. What Edward once thought was his safety net would soon become the noose tightening around his neck. Day by day, I gathered evidence in silence. Bank statements showing irregular transfers, jewelry receipts, and luxury dinners never listed in our household expenses. Sweet text messages between Edward and Rachel, carefully stored on a USB. And finally, recordings of conversations Edward never realized I overheard. I stacked it all together and sealed it inside a cream-colored envelope. The night before graduation, I sat at my desk, pressing the flap shut. My fingers trembled, not with fear, but with a bitter exhilaration. After years of patience, the time had come to claim justice. The next morning, as I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw just a wife. I saw a warrior, carrying the trump card Edward never imagined was waiting for him. That envelope was my declaration of war. That night in Charleston was heavy and humid. I drove back to the familiar 2-story house that had once held decades of memories. Now it felt like a silent battlefield. When I stepped into the bedroom, I wasn't surprised to see suitcases neatly stacked in the corner. Edward's clothes folded carefully, a few suits still hanging. He had prepared everything for his dramatic departure, ready to walk out the very next day. I smiled coldly. Edward was always meticulous about clothes, yet careless about the things that truly mattered. Moments later, the front door slammed. Edward stormed in, face flushed red, clutching the cream envelope I had left on the banquet table. "Victoria!" he barked, his voice ragged. "What the hell is this?" "You served divorce papers on Sophia's graduation day?" I sat calmly on the living room sofa, laptop open with files neatly displayed. I closed it and looked up. "You wanted to start a new life." "I'm just helping you get there faster." He threw the envelope onto the table, papers scattering. "You have no right." "We've been together 28 years, I answered evenly, my voice steady. "And you chose to destroy it with betrayal. That was your choice, not mine," he sneered, forcing a smirk. "That prenup expired years ago. Any lawyer will tell you that I arched a brow, my gaze sharp." "Are you sure?" Clause 12 states the fidelity clause remains valid until the marriage ends. You didn't read carefully, or maybe you just assumed I'd stay blind forever. Color drained from his face. For a moment, the arrogance slipped and fear showed through. My phone buzzed. It was Sophia. Her voice trembled on the line. "Mom, I can't believe Dad did that in front of everyone. I'm so ashamed." I softened my tone, pouring warmth into every word. "No, sweetheart. This isn't your fault. Enjoy your graduation. I'll handle the rest." When I hung up, Edward's eyes met mine, bloodshot, filled with anger and dread. You recorded me?" "You set me up?" I rose to my feet, taking a step toward him. "I didn't set a trap, Edward. I simply showed you your true face. And now the world will see it too. The knock at the door came just as the air in the house grew taut like a drawn bowstring. I hadn't answered yet when the door swung open. Eleanor, Edward's sister, stormed in, her face flushed with anger. "Do you have any idea what I had to hear at that restaurant today, Edward?" she snapped. "You humiliated Victoria, and you humiliated Sophia in front of everyone. You've gone too far." Edward spun toward her, eyes wide. "Eleanor, you don't understand. This is between me and Victoria. Stay out of it." Eleanor folded her arms, her gaze like steel. "Between you two? I saw you with Rachel last Christmas. I gave you the chance to end it quietly, but you chose this path. Don't expect me to keep your secrets anymore." Edward froze, stunned that his own sister had taken my side. His face shifted between shock and fury. Then came another knock. I looked toward the door and saw Rachel standing there, hesitant. She stepped inside, her eyes darting nervously around the room, avoiding mine. "Edward," Rachel's voice shook. "You never told me about that private account. Victoria mentioned it. Is it true?" Edward faltered, waving his hands defensively. "No, it's nothing. Just a small emergency fund. Nothing important." I let out a soft, cutting laugh, my eyes locking on Rachel. "Small? For over a year, he's been transferring nearly $200,000 from our joint account into an account under his name only, and none of that money was used for this family." Rachel's head snapped toward Edward, fury flaring in her eyes. "200,000? You promised me a beachfront house, a new life, and now I find out you've been hiding money from me too? Were you planning to build this new paradise with lies?" Sweat beaded at Edward's temple as he stammered, I just wanted to make sure I had a safety net if things fell apart." Rachel stepped back, her lips trembling, her face etched with betrayal. "So, I was just another pawn in your game. You never intended to give me everything, did you?" The air in the room turned suffocating. Edward shot me a venomous look, but it was useless now. The truth was laid bare. The man who dreamed of building a new life had been deceiving both women at the same time. I stood silently, watching. I didn't need to say a word. Edward was digging his own grave. For the first time in years, I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. I had allies now, and the betrayer was finally tasting betrayal himself. 3 days later, the Charleston County Courthouse was packed. News of Edward abandoning his wife during their daughter's graduation party had spread across the community. People whispered, gathering to witness the trial as if it were a play they couldn't miss. I walked in with my attorney, Martin, carrying a thick file of evidence. Dressed in a simple black suit, my hair tied neatly, my eyes calm, I was no longer the quiet wife standing behind her husband, but a warrior entering the courtroom. Across from me, Edward sat with a young lawyer he had hired in haste. His face was red, his eyes restless. Behind him, Rachel was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she had withdrawn after realizing she too had been deceived. Judge Carter, a woman in her 60s with sharp, unforgiving eyes, struck her gavel. "We are here to review the divorce petition between Victoria and Edward Hale, along with the terms of their prenuptial agreement signed 28 years ago." Edward's lawyer hurried to speak. "Your Honor, this agreement has expired. 28 years is far too long. We argue that the fidelity clause is no longer valid." Martin stood calmly, adjusting his glasses, his voice firm. "With permission, I quote Clause 12 of the agreement. The fidelity clause remains in effect until the marriage is legally dissolved, including all related proceedings. There is no expiration date." Judge Carter flipped through the contract, scanning quickly, then looked up. "That is correct. This clause remains legally binding." Edward gripped the edge of the table, his face draining of color. But his nightmare wasn't over yet. Martin inserted a USB drive and projected evidence for the court. Bank statements showing nearly $200,000 transferred into Edward's private account. Jewelry receipts and luxury dinner bills. text messages between Edward and Rachel discussing their beachfront condo, and finally, a recording of Edward's own voice. Announcing it at the graduation party will silence her. She won't dare make a scene in front of everyone. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, gasps, whispers, heads shaking. Edward bowed his head, sweat trickling down his temple. Judge Carter struck her gavel again, her voice cutting through the noise. Given the overwhelming evidence, the court orders a freeze on all joint accounts until asset division is complete. The marital home will remain in Victoria's possession, as stipulated in the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause. Edward leapt up, shouting, "This is a farce! I gave my whole life to this family." Carter fixed him with a glare, sharp as a blade. "Mr. Hale, I suggest you carefully review what you signed. This court will reconvene in 30 days for final division." I smiled faintly, rising with Martin. As we walked out, the buzz of voices followed. "She's the one in control." That was a masterstroke. And Edward? He sat motionless, eyes hollow, tasting for the first time in his life the bitter reality of losing all control. 2 weeks after the hearing, news spread like wildfire. In Charleston, where Edward had long been known as the successful businessman, devoted husband, people now spoke his name with disdain. Mutual friends called, some to comfort, others just to gossip. My only response was simple. We're divorcing. These things happen. But inside, I knew Edward's mask had fallen for good. Bad news struck him one blow after another. The beachfront condo deal was canceled because his accounts were frozen. The deposit on his new sports car had to be returned. Business partners began pulling away once they heard about the financial scandal. And then I heard that Rachel had left him. Eleanor recounted with a trace of irony. She said she wasn't signing up to date a man with an empty wallet. Turns out love has an expiration date and a credit limit. I simply smiled. The man who once believed he could build a new paradise had lost his mistress, his reputation, and was on the verge of losing his fortune. Meanwhile, I finally set in motion the dream I had buried for years, opening a financial consultancy for women. From a small rented office downtown, I welcomed my first clients, most of them women navigating divorce or struggling with family finances. "I know what this pain feels like," I told them, "but we can turn it into power." Sophia called nearly every day from her new job in Charleston. She said, "I'm so proud of you, Mom, not just because you stood strong, but because you're helping others do the same." Looking back, I realized Edward's collapse wasn't the end. It was simply the first domino to fall, clearing the path for a new life. One where I was no longer just Edward's wife or Sophia's mother, but myself, Victoria, the woman who claimed her own destiny. The final court hearing took place on what would have been our 29th wedding anniversary. A bitter coincidence, but also the perfect ending to a chapter that had lasted nearly 3 decades. I entered the courtroom in a navy blue dress, my gaze calm. Beside me, Martin carried the complete file of financial reports. Across from us, Edward appeared disheveled, stubble on his face, dark circles under his eyes, his suit hanging loosely as if borrowed. The man who once strutted in with smug confidence was now just a hollow shadow. Judge Carter struck her gavel, her voice firm. "After reviewing all evidence, testimonies, and the prenuptial agreement, the court rules as follows. The fidelity clause remains in full effect. Mrs. Victoria Hale shall retain the marital home, her retirement accounts, and 70% of all joint investments. Mr. Edward Hale shall keep only his personal belongings and his business, currently in financial decline." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Edward sat frozen, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. I looked at him briefly, not with hatred, but with a faint sorrow for the man who had once held my hand through life's storms. As the hearing adjourned, Edward shuffled toward me, his voice low and hoarse. I made a mistake. Is there any chance left?" I met the eyes that once felt so familiar, then shook my head gently. "That door is closed, Edward. Find a way to rebuild your life. As for me, I'll walk my own path now." For a rare moment, he nodded, his lips trembling. "I understand. And you deserve happiness." I turned and walked away, leaving behind 29 years of history. Outside, the Charleston sun poured over the courthouse steps. I drew in a deep breath, feeling lighter. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was freedom. The final hearing had not only stripped Edward of everything he had greedily clung to, it returned to me the most valuable thing of all, my freedom. 6 months after the final hearing, my life had turned into an entirely new chapter. My financial consultancy, Caldwell Financial Transitions, grew so quickly that I had to hire 2 associates. From women who first walked in timidly with stacks of disorganized papers, I watched them leave with eyes lit by confidence. I wasn't just helping them balance numbers, I was giving them the tools to take back control of their lives. Every day, when I saw a client sign a contract or heard a woman whisper, "Thank you, I think I can stand on my own now," I knew I was finally doing the work I should have started years ago. Sophia often visited on weekends, bringing her bright smile. She once told me, "You know, Mom, if Dad had just been honest from the beginning, he might have kept half of everything. But his greed cost him it all." I only smiled. No bitterness, no hatred remained. I had learned that some losses are necessary to set both people free. The house in Charleston now carried a different energy. I planted flowers on the porch, turned the living room into a welcoming space for friends. The old family photos still hung on the walls, but they were no longer wounds. They were memories, and memories no longer held power over me. I also began writing a small book, recounting my journey, from betrayed wife to independent woman, not to smear Edward, but to share a message. Never underestimate the power of patience and preparation. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the Charleston sky burn red with sunset, I realized that cream-colored envelope was not only the beginning of revenge, but also the key to my freedom. I had lost a husband, but I had found someone far more valuable, myself, and that was the greatest victory of all.